Welcome to the Agile Wire, where professional Scrum trainers Jeff Boobles and Jeff Molesky discuss Agile topics. Now, here are your hosts, Jeff Boobles and Jeff Molesky.
And we are recording. All right, Mr. Boobles, kick us off, man.
All right, this week on the podcast, we got Maarten Dalmijn joining us. Maarten is across the ocean here, and we're talking about patterns today. So patterns of teams that we walk into them and start working with them. What are high performing teams doing, and what are teams that are maybe struggling doing? And so I don't know, Maarten, what you got a first one that kind of comes to mind as we talk about these patterns that we see emerging?
Yeah. So one of the things I notice with lower performing teams, if I may call it that way, is that they really focus on delivering what was promised, basically. So somebody asked them, "Hey, deliver this feature." They're going to break it all down, and then they're going to go into a room and start working on delivering this feature. And then if they deliver it on time, everybody's happy, and if they don't deliver it on time, people are sad. And that's basically
it's that metric of estimated versus actuals, and they're actually comparing that. When you see that, probably an indicator right to what you're saying there is we're just doing the things,
And the interesting thing is, why does it happen, right? Because in my experience, I'm also curious to hear your experience, it very often happens because of outside forces, because they are basically, there's some manager that has a spreadsheet that looks at completed versus committed. And if it's 95% and higher, life is great. Or that the velocity increases, over time. And basically all these how you say, metrics, if a team acts like that, they're rewarded. So there's no incentive to do something else than just churn out the features.
Yeah, I think it probably comes from the traditional project management days when we, it was measuring activities and delegating tasks to different people. And it was just you get all the things done. Everybody shoots their round of golf and we add it all up and hopefully we have a good product at the end. I think it's still left over from those days, and, old habits die hard. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very plausible explanation. I also think then another problem is, what's the alternative, right? Because everybody says, even if you do agree that we shouldn't be focusing on delivering more features, what do we do instead? And then it becomes very difficult and very murky. And then people probably will be thinking okay, yeah, that's too difficult. Let's go back to delivering features on time. We can do that. We can measure that. So maybe that also plays a role. It's not easy.
Yeah, I think a better solution is the focus on problems. Yeah. But if you focus on problems, then I actually need to have a problem-solving team. Then I actually just can't put Scrum over the top of my existing departments. And I actually have to have a product definition that has problems that I'm solving for a customer. And that is a lot of change for a lot of organizations. But if you focus on problems as a work thing or value that's delivered when you solve a problem for somebody, I think that could give you metrics. And sometimes you're wrong, right? You think you're solving a problem for somebody. And I think it's hard to say, well, did you make a good decision there on trying to solve that problem? Did you make a decision that's going to be successful 80% of the time, but you hit the 20%? Or, are you making poor decisions? And it's squishy. It's not binary, yes and no. And as, we know people that like to build software, especially in our field, they like things black and white. And I don't know that it's always black and white. It's usually gray.
Yeah, I think you're touching on a really important point. So I also think value is just such a complicated topic, because imagine you're working in e-commerce and you decide, hey, we're going to add a new payment method, and the market share is 20%. You could probably pretty easily predict how much money it's going to bring in. But imagine you're like me. I'm working at a SaaS company building project management software. And let's say we deliver an awesome planner and it reduces the time for project managers to plan their project by 50%. How much money would it bring in the bank? It's it's very different question. It's much more difficult to put a number on it. And I think that's what causes a lot of these conflicts. Everybody talks about value like it's business value, but it starts with the customer. And then how do you express that customer value and business value? That gap, that is very difficult to bridge, I think.
So when you guys were talking about those problems to solve, what was going on in my head was, it still requires a team to execute on the work. It still requires a team to get stuff done, right? Whether we're marching to a date or whatever that case may be. So where do you differentiate when you were talking about those patterns earlier? Like, yeah, we can have a team that's focused on solving a problem, but it still requires that problem to be deconstructed into increments of work that we can deliver on.
Mm-hmm.
So if we've got a team that has deconstructed a problem and is delivering increments of value towards solving that problem, I guess where's the gray area? Where does the shift all of a sudden become a bad pattern versus a good pattern?
Yeah. So what I think is really important is, so when we talk about Scrum or Agile, we're doing complex work, right? So a lot of teams focus on this complexity of the plan, right? Like the complexity that you don't know everything
Mm-hmm.
before you start, so your plan is going to deviate. But I think the biggest, most uncertain thing is the value uncertainty. Like, how do we know that what we're doing delivers value? And what I think is really important is, if you don't have a model for how your product is delivering value to your customer, and as well like the monetization aspect of it, then it's very difficult to push a feature out and see what is the lagging impact on your business. Because let's be real, if you change, like I said in my example, 50% reduction of time to plan a project, even if it's an amazing feature and project managers are going to sign up, it takes some time. And I think that gap, it means you need to have some kind of model. And for example, the North Star framework is a model I really like, which you can start using to measure these kind of things. Because what it basically says is, so normally in a feature factory model, it kind of says, you've got the work, you do the work, you get value. And in between, it's a black box. In the North Star framework, what do they say is, you need to define a North Star. So a metric which captures both your business value and your customer value. So a very concrete example, which is often used, is Spotify, right? Time spent listening to music. It's a great North Star because it reflects customer value. So imagine you, Jeff, you're listening more to Spotify. It will increase the time spent listening to music. But imagine you get more subscribers, that will also increase the time spent listening to music. And then the next part is, so this is just something which represents value. And then you need to have this constellation of inputs. That's the way the North Star framework phrases it, which influence this North Star. And that means then you can have a feature which influences an input, which then influences your North Star. And then over time, that will influence your business. And I think that nature of it makes it very difficult. And yeah, if you don't have a model like a North Star framework, which is a great starting point, then it's kind of like, okay, we don't know how to do this. Let's deliver features.
Yeah, and I think you can almost break that down inside of like a customer experience, right? So inside of a customer experience, you might have different North Stars that you're trying to get to, like a typical e-commerce site, right? Like going ahead and finding a review. Maybe people can't find reviews, and so don't even get it to the shopping cart, right? So like they look and you have really fast drop-off rates, or maybe they're getting it into the shopping cart, but then they're abandoning it because your payment processing system sucks or something, right? So you can do something on steps of this workflow, this customer experience to improve it, but you get metrics. But then, your number one problem, you've solved that. Now you have your number two becomes your number one, and you got another problem. Like you might not get the customer, impact company impact that you're looking for, but it's because you've solved some problem, but now you have this other big problem that you need to solve, right? So,
and the beauty of it is, so in the North Star framework, you have this constellation of inputs. So what you're saying, like for example, the credibility of your reviews could be like one input, right? Like the amount of reviews. And as you do experiments and you learn more, your model can evolve. Like some things may be more important, some less. So I think it's a really nice way, at least, to get started on this journey, because you don't need to start with a lot, and it can evolve over time as you do stuff and learn more.
So as we're thinking about that, so I'm like, I like that we have a connection of metrics to companies, right? Like the things I do every day translate to some benefit to society, to a customer, to the company, right? Like being able to see that, I think that's a good pattern if you have something along those lines. Even if you don't have that, I mean, I'm just thinking of like, if we took an Agile manifesto like approach here, like what would we say is we'd want over estimates versus actuals? I'm thinking flow might be a good word to use there. So I'd rather have consistent flow of delivery and then over estimates versus actual. It doesn't really, I just need consistent delivery. And so that I can have consistent learning, just a little bit of everything all the time. I guess I think back to that, blog post. I don't know if you've read it, that Daniel Vacante and Pradeep put out about the don't be a Ditka.
No, I didn't read it.
Anyway, the whole point of the thing is like they talk about like they made a football analogy to product, and they talked about how when you like in I think it was 99, there was the Saints traded up from like the 12th pick to the 5th pick. They gave away all their picks for that draft, and then a couple of the next draft. They lost 9 picks. And then that next draft, Tom Brady, the greatest NFL football player of all time, was drafted at 199. So like they gave up 9 picks where they could have drafted him, right? Like, but they don't really know. And so like in product, aren't we just better off having consistent delivery? And maybe then we can make better decisions on what to do. But making that one big bet, like a lot of times it doesn't work out well. You know, we think it's going to, but these are all just assumed value that we're going to get. And it doesn't really become actuals until we put it in the market and we learn from that. So if you have consistent flow, you have more opportunities for good things to happen. And that's really all we can do is put an environment in place where there's a really good potential that we're going to be successful, but there's no guarantees, right? Like the world is not deterministic. It's very, I don't know, what's the opposite of that?
Stochastic, I think. I don't know.
Yeah.
So, yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And what's interesting is, so I recently had another post from John Cutler, which was actually pretty similar in the sense that he wrote a post like, so he's like known as the feature factory guy, where he writes about like, hey, how do you overcome the feature factory? But what he actually wrote is, if you're in a place that is not able to deliver, it's okay to make them a feature factory first. Because if you cannot deliver, then you cannot learn.
Yep.
And then, yeah, you're better off start like going towards that feature factory, and then because otherwise you don't have the speed of learning, you don't have the short feedback cycles. You're not going to get there anyhow. So, and what's interesting is I've actually been in situations where I did this. So I joined a company, they were a feature factory, they were not delivering, and I felt bad because it was like I'm writing about like not doing the feature factory, but I was doing that. I was making them a great feature factory, and yeah, and he articulated beautifully like, if you do not deliver, then you should fix that first, because if you don't have this flow,
yes,
you're not going to have the learnings.
I think this ties in really well, at least in my head. The connections I'm making is having I'm going to use maturity here twice, but having the maturity as whatever you want to call yourself, a coach, a transformation agent, a change agent, whatever. Having the maturity to recognize the maturity of the organization that you are working with, right? And understanding that wherever they are today, a step in the right direction is a step in the right direction. It may not be the ideal end state that you want to be at, but it's probably better than what they were at before. And I just, man, too often I think I'll speak personally from my past. I wanted to get to that end state too quickly. I wanted to skip the middle the middle phase and jump right to that ideal end state. But the organization was not ready for that. The team was not ready for that. They were ready for just that first small step forward. And exactly like what you're talking about, Maarten, is that's we need to recognize where the people that we are working at are at on their own maturity journey, and compensate where necessary.
Yeah. So yeah, I completely agree. So I actually learned this from Christian Verwijs. So he actually said, like, meet people where they are, not where you want them to be. It's kind of what you're saying.
Yeah,
I think that's incredibly difficult to do. And it requires incredible patience. And that's why I'm a product owner. Like, I'm not that patient, to be honest. I'm working on it. But yeah, because basically you know that they are here and you want to be here. But you need to take... and I actually wrote an article, like, because basically you probably know that there are these stories where people like trade a red paperclip for a house, right? So they end up with a house. But the reality is,
right,
they start with a red paperclip, it becomes a pen, it becomes a bike, it becomes... Like, and that's the same thing that happens with your Scrum teams. Like, you cannot trade a red paperclip for a house. It's not going to happen. You need to take all these little steps in between. And only if you do that, and it's called like the adjacent possible, like what is possible from where they're at the moment.
Yeah, I think we've had this debate many, many times, right, with different guests, Jeff, right? And I think one of our first episodes, we debated this for a whole entire hour with one of our guests. Like, what's more important, delivering customer value, or just getting to frequent delivery and focusing on the customer? And we said, well, you got to have the delivery. And I like the way Stephen Denning talks about it as like operational agility versus strategic agility. And if you don't have operational agility, be able to deliver frequently with a cross-functional team, right? Like, then there's no hope for strategic agility. So you're just, you're just having all these handoffs, you're going to have long delays. And if you can't deliver frequently, well, then that's really going to be your root problem. And everything else isn't going to quite work well. And go ahead, Jeff.
Sorry, I was just going to jump in because there's something I wanted to chime in with earlier. But when you were thinking about favoring X over Y, and I think it ties in nicely with what your strategic agility here is, favoring objective measures of success versus subjective measures of success. And that's one of, like, again, back to Maarten, what you were talking about earlier is oftentimes, like, I like throwing the question out, like, hey, when we ship this feature, how are we going to know it's successful, right? Like, oftentimes it's the date, right? If we get this thing done by this date, are we all going to celebrate? Yeah, but what happens if there's no customer change? What happens if there's no additional value that's brought in? Like, are we still going to think of that thing as success? All right, well, let's flip it around. Let's pretend that we missed the date. All right, oh goodness, we shipped it out a month later or whatever that happens to be. But we saw phenomenal success. We doubled our revenue. We have increased our customer satisfaction score, whatever that happens to be. Would we still consider that feature successful? And I'm willing to bet the answer to that question is going to be yes. We would still consider that feature successful. So in that story, clearly, to me, the emphasis is on the outcomes inside of that. So before we get to that point, when we're thinking about sequencing the work and what is the bet that we want to be making, we should be thinking, what are we going to be celebrating when this thing is released, right? And then that helps us lead us to the why of this, maybe the pain point. Now, oftentimes that's a little bit reversal because we missed the step of actually figuring out what the pain point is we wanted to solve in the first place, or the job, or however we want to articulate that in the product space. But we're often working in reverse from that because we missed that critical piece. So if you skipped it, that's just a little tactic that I use to help kind of suss out, like, hey, what are those actual measures of success after we've already started building the thing or thinking about delivering the thing.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And that ties maybe to an interesting point. So we talked about, like, it's like, what are these patterns, right? So roadmaps, like if you have these feature-driven roadmaps, then the only thing you can do is reverse engineer, like you said. So that's also, I think, another key thing. How do you say, as you said, like, how do you recognize, like, as a Scrum Master, as a coach, where your team's at? I think one of the first things I always take a look at is the roadmap, not because it's where the teams is at, but it says a lot about the organization, like how the organization does road mapping. That tells you very often what they're at. Because if you see a 9-month roadmap, each team has their own roadmap. There are, like, if you put them all together, there are 100 items on there. Then you know that every team is going to be working on delivering their roadmap. And when they need each other, which they always do, right? Because you don't have perfect cross-functional teams, you always have dependencies. Then everybody will be like, yeah, I need to deliver this roadmap, and they're not going to help each other.
Yeah, and the other interesting thing inside of there is, so often when teams are looking at their roadmap, when we say teams, I think again, I'll speak personally. When I hear team, oftentimes my mind goes right to delivery team. It's some sort of engineering team. It's the team that's actually building something. But what about your operations team? What about your sales team? What about your marketing team? What about your legal team, right? Like, all those dependencies that you just called out in there, who's putting together the fact that 7 of those teams all require the marketing team come October, because that's when they're going to put out their big push for the Christmas season, right? Like, and then all of a sudden your marketing team is slammed at 300, 500% because nobody was taking those other work streams into account, or those dependencies into account, because we were so fixated on just the build it piece of the engineering side.
I think you're touching a really beautiful point. And to be honest, like, that's why I really think looking at the roadmap tells you a lot. And that's always what I recommend. If you're in a job interview, ask them, can you please show me the roadmap? Like, and not always they will do that, right? But it provides you a lot of information, like where they're at and the way they're working.
So if we were going to do another favor here, I would say that on the far side is we want to avoid long-term detailed feature-driven roadmaps, right? Like I want to break down those words. So long-term detailed planning, that's very wasteful because we know things are going to change. We're also thinking that we can predict the future at a very detailed level. and we just know we can. So why do that and like set some expectation that we know we're not going to hit that, and that's not even going to where we want to be into the future. So I think that's wasteful. But what is the thing that we want to do instead of that? What would we phrase that as?
Yeah. So what I typically try to do is like having now, next, later roadmaps where maybe the stuff that you're working on at the moment, you have like a due date, because I think it's reasonable to expect like to know when something is done. I don't think that's bad, right? Like, and you can update it. It's a forecast. I think that's a good way to start. And ideally, right, you have it more focused on what you're trying to achieve rather than the features. But as we said before, like if they're really in this feature factory mindset, you cannot change that immediately, but it's a good place, maybe a good next step. And then get them from there, get them more focused on these, solving problems and maybe knowing like, what are the outcomes how will we know like that we solve those problems?
Could we phrase it this way? Favor midterm goal problem driven roadmaps over long-term detailed feature driven roadmaps. I think the contrast there is like, we don't want to break work down too detailed. We want to keep it at the problem goal level until we actually get down to like the near term of what we're actually going to do. And then we'll figure that out, because context will change and we need to be able to reserve the right to change our approach to that when we get to that time.
Yeah. As you were talking about, Jeff, one of the things that I was starting to experiment before I left Acorns was for the roadmaps that I was working on and putting together. It was basically a very how-based roadmap for the first 6 months. It was, how are we going to solve these problems and what are the benefits going to be? And then after that, it shifted out to what did we want to it was basically problems that we wanted to solve and what we thought the benefits of them were. And the reason I was thinking about it that way is, one, leaving my options open to, as we got closer to that, right? Like as time transitions, we can start thinking more about, is this the right problem to be solving? And then how do we want to solve that problem? And investing more time in kind of, Maarten, to your now, next, later, right? That now is more of the 3 to 6 months time frame. That's where I want to be tactical, that we have figured out that, yes, this is the right problem to be solving. There is value in solving this problem. We've verified that value, and we have a good understanding of how we want to solve that problem. And so then it becomes feature X, Y, and Z. And here's the benefits of what we get out of it. But then 6 months out from there, it's, hey, we want to solve the problem of our customer wait time when they call into support, right? Like currently they're waiting 5 minutes. We want to get that down to 1. All right. That's the key problem that we want to solve. And here's the benefits that we think we're going to get out of it. But leave the how until it starts getting closer to us. And then that just frees you those benefits I was talking about, the optionality. And I don't like, as that problem statement approaches, if we decide it's not the right problem to be solving, a bigger problem has bubbled up, we didn't waste any time going in and figuring out a way to solve that problem. So trying to reduce waste from looking too long-term into the future. And then plus, like, when we've talked about this, but as soon as you put something on your roadmap, like you have committed to that shit, right? That shit is getting done because it's now on our roadmap. But it just kind of like decouples that feeling of commitment a little bit when you haven't put the tactical answer. You've just put the problem that you wanted to solve on there. So, but anyway, that was just like something I was just starting to experiment with, but it's something that I'd like to continue moving forward here with the area I'm working with now.
So what I really like about your approach, like you said, like by breaking down the features as late as possible, then basically you prevent having a long product backlog, which is extremely wasteful. And that also means that your product backlog is not enriched with the latest insights and understanding. So by doing what you're doing, basically, you're keeping it short and keeping your options open. And I think that's super important because, I've arrived at teams with backlogs that were 2 years or 3 years long. And that's really a mess.
What are you thinking, Jeff?
So I was just thinking of another favorite one here. Like this is another like very like quantitative thing you could do walking into a team. Like favor short-term emergent product backlogs. Or I don't know if it's short, but it's like less things on them. A smaller subset of things, emergent product backlog over a very detailed long-term static product backlog.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's like what I generally try to do when I come in, if I see a long product backlog, then I just start talking to stakeholders and saying, hey, like, I'm going to clean it up. And is there anything on there which must be done? Let me know. But it's going to go. Otherwise, I'm going to delete it. And yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What is that? Like, what's your rule of thumb for when do you start burning a backlog?
So here's the thing. Like, personally, what I try to do is only for the current sprint and maybe next sprint, I have refined work. I don't want to have more.
Mm-hmm.
And there might be some epics on there, right? Which can be big, as you know. But that's it. I don't want to have more. And yeah. So I don't want to have long product backlogs at all. Like, maybe if you look at it this way, there will be like 30 or 40 items, maybe 50, not more. Because yeah, what I also don't like is hoarding all these bugs and all these issues. Like, if it's urgent and important, pick it up, right? If it's urgent and not important, like, I prefer making decisions. Like, and if I close something which is important, but I believe not important, it will most of the time come back. So I'm not that worried. I'm more worried that we do something which is unnecessary. If it's necessary, you're gonna hear about it again. Like, I can guarantee you. But if it's unnecessary and you close it, you will probably never hear about it again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, Jeff, it's like 1 to 3 sprints, but how I determine of refined work ready to go. But how I determine that is like, if things change dynamically enough, or we need to preserve options because of things outside of the control of the team, then we might need more. And so I'll give you an example. Like, if I'm a company or a team working on a product area, and my customers don't get back to me, and all I have these dependencies on the work that I'm working on, and I can't solve them, and I need to put those things down, and that consistently happens, then I need to have enough work that I can pull and pivot to another direction that's going to be similar in value. And maybe I need shorter planning horizons then, if that's what's happening, or I need to figure out better ways to like remove those dependencies. But in the near term, like, I want to have enough work where I have options, and I need options that, like, saying, well, we're stuck and we don't know what to do, and then to go get the information to figure out what to do next is going to take us 3 days. That's unacceptable. Like, that's 3 days of run rate for a team. Like, that's very expensive. So I think you got to balance those things, right? Like, don't go too far, but like, go far enough. And so you got to find that right context for your team. And then I like to have, just like you said, like, bigger items, bigger problems kind of down the list. And as they work their way up and we're like, now we're 3 sprints out, let's start figuring that thing out. Let's do that, So, yeah, I think, I don't know, if I had to throw a number out there, I've heard a number of people say this number, and I think I've tried it and used it. I think 50 is a good number. Like, if you're around that 50 number, I think you can consciously know the difference between each of the items. When I say, what's the difference between 40 and 41, as a product owner, I think you probably know. When I say, what's the difference between 122 and 123, you have no idea. Like, at some point, it's just too much to keep track of.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And what's interesting is one thing we didn't tackle is psychological safety. And I do think that matters, because what I tend to see as well, if there's no psychological safety, then you're going to sit in refinement endlessly. Everything's going to be discussed 5 times. They want to know what they're doing ahead of time, way ahead of time. So I also think, like, working this way, as we're kind of advocating, it requires quite a lot of psychological safety, because if you have a team that doesn't feel safe and you tell them from one sprint to the other, hey, we're going to completely change direction, everybody's going to be all jittery and stressed and unhappy. Like, I really think that's also a really important prerequisite, because otherwise they will expect those long plans to feel safe.
Yeah. So why everyone wants psychological safety, right? Like, so what's the pattern we would see when people don't have psychological safety? From that, like, I want very detailed plans, because we keep going down this path of like the detailed plans versus the broad goal problem type planning.
I think long time in sprint planning, like refining the same thing 5 times over because of little details you could literally figure out during the sprint. But they're like, yeah, we don't know this, so we cannot do it. I think those are really common ones. And as well, like, if there's a problem, then they will come to you and they will immediately, like, kind of throw it over the fence. Like, there's a problem. Like, tell me what to do. You know what I mean? Because they don't want to make a mistake. So a lot of hand-holding is necessary during the sprint by the product owner.
Yeah. Yeah. And if I think back to, so why does that happen? Let's ask why on that maybe a few times and see if we can think of like common patterns that we would see. So why do people want, when they have long detailed planning, why does that occur from a product standpoint? Honestly, I think it's when the product owner isn't empowered and they aren't given the authority to make decisions. And so when decisions are made by a group of people, even though we might have a product owner by name, but when there is a group like a steering committee or a group of key stakeholders and they're like the ones driving decision making on where we're going, I think a team doesn't know where we're going from a vision standpoint. If there isn't a vision from a product standpoint and there isn't a strategy, then they want to be very, very detailed on what they've done because they've been burned in the past, likely, where one person said go this direction, one person said go this direction, there's a conflict, and then they got blamed because they're the one doing the work. And that removes safety because you don't understand where you're going. And so it's kind of like walking around with your eyes shut, where you just are like, tell me what step to take next. Like, am I taking like a big step to the right or a little step to the right? And you want every little detail defined for you.
Yeah, no.
I don't know. What do you think? What do you guys think? Is that a pattern that you've seen as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely recognize it. What about you, Jeff?
I'm sorry, guys. I was just thinking about applying it to my space, and where I struggle a little bit is the appropriate amount of documentation that needs to be done. Like it's such a hard, or maybe gray area is probably a better descriptor there, because I'm thinking in my domain of those other work streams that I was talking about, right? So let's say we've got a new feature that we want to roll out, and it requires input from our legal team, because the legal team has to go and work with the banks, because the banks have to agree to operate under the rule structure that we set up. So the legal team has to be involved. The rules team, who are literally writing the rules that the banks have to abide by, have to be involved with that. The fraud risk team needs to be involved because they need to understand the data structure so that they can feed it into the fraud risk engine. The engineering team has to be involved because they're the ones that actually have to build it. So they're the ones that are architecting the data and how it's laid out. The operations team needs, and I can keep going down this list, right? And this is just for one feature. So I do think there's levels of gray inside of here where you need to understand what is the appropriate level of documentation that is needed for these things so that everybody can have alignment on, because this is not one of those things where we can just figure it out the day of when the Scrum team is going to be together building it. Like, no, that's bullshit. That's not going to work for us, right? Like that lead time of having the legal team work with the banks is months, right? So there is a certain degree of this stuff that does need to be set up ahead of time, and it's domain specific and context matters and all of that jazz. So I guess in my head, I was feeling maybe a little bit defensive, where it's like, documentation is not bad. Over documentation is bad. Being too prescriptive with answers is bad. But your context matters, and there's a big difference between that feature maybe that I was just describing and, moving the checkout button to a different location on the screen, right? So I guess maybe the context or the takeaway there is it depends, and context is important.
So my rule of thumb has always been minimal but sufficient from documentation.
You're stealing my thunder.
Were you going to say this? We've talked about that before, yeah. But I think that, to your point, Jeff, like sufficient in the context you just gave in that story is very detailed planning, because there are a lot of parties that care about this, and it's like not going to see the light of day unless it meets all these stakeholder needs, or at least they're aligned on where we're going, because you have multiple personas there that are going to stop everything. And then that's a horrible customer experience if they do that, right? So you just can't let that happen. So I think, it's context matters, and every situation matters. Every feature it matters in, right? And so like to do that feature, it's going to take a lot more refinement. And I don't know, Maarten, I love what you were saying. Like, yeah, we don't want to see us talking about things many, many, many times over again and get to the nth degree. But in Jeff's story, maybe we do, because we got to get all these different people on board to move forward. But not all the time. And I think we favor that all the time. Yeah. We have a hard time operating in the gray where it's like, well, we did this on one feature. We should do it for all the features. It's like, no, like it's emergent what we need to do there. And we need to figure that out on a case by case basis.
Yeah. In fact, one of the things I'm trying to like, I feel like checklists get a bad rap, right? But it's when the point is to check the box, like that's when it gets a bad rap. But like if the point of the checklist is to save you from something, I think the checklist can be valuable there. And so what I mean by that is all of those, we call them work streams internally, but they're like more like component teams, right? Like legal, ops, marketing, sales, all that stuff are their own business functions or areas. And so as a new product or feature is coming through, like we just have a checkbox, like, have I run this past the sales and marketing team? And have they identified if there's any work that is contingent on it, right? Like, in addition to that scenario I was just talking about, right? Like that new feature should be part of the sales strategy. If they have to be going out to the banks or whoever to try to get them on board and understanding like, oh, here's the feature set that you're going to be able to take care of, right? Like that needs to be taken care of. And maybe it's their individual work stream that's going to do that work. And then there should be a dependency mapping back to over, or is that some level of feedback that needs to go on there? But nonetheless, back to the checkbox is that first step of just making sure that getting your ducks in a row of understanding, take a holistic view of your feature and all the components or areas of the business that might be impacted of it, and just saying quick yes or no to that. And then that kind of charts out your future refinement sessions of the stakeholders that need to be involved in those discussions. Because for me, it's a big thing of like, you don't know what you don't know. Something that you might think is, as a product manager, isn't that impactful to another area of the organization. All of a sudden, your operations, your customer support team is banging at your door saying, no, Jeff, you didn't consider this. This is going to be a pain point when they call in because we're not able to give them this information legally or whatever the case may be. Or, oh, we're going to have to point them back to the banks. You didn't realize this, right? It's a lot of those unknown unknowns that are going to get you that you can flesh out as you're going through those refinements up front.
So that's a great topic. How do you handle those unknown unknowns? Like what is a good strategy for those or good pattern to handle those?
So, I mean, what I personally think, if it's an unknown unknown, it's kind of like you need to roll up your sleeves, do stuff, and then you find them. Like, I think that's the main thing. Like, I think the main reason why we're doing Scrum or an Agile way of working is like you're working what you do know to figure out what you don't know. Like, and that's also why we have to empower teams, like the short feedback loops, because you know what you know isn't good enough. And that's also why, well, in Jeff's example, and I think I really agree with him, like it's a highly situational. The example I gave is probably much more applicable for startups and scale-ups. And then when you go to bigger companies, which have all these departments, which have to, because of regulatory reasons, give approvals or whatever, it becomes more difficult. But still, that brings me back to my initial point. Scrum is about empower teams, right? So when are do these teams become disempowered because they have so many of these other teams they need to do their job, right? That's the question I always have, like, because that's the core of Scrum, like these empowered or these self-managing teams or self-organizing, how you want to call it. But at some point, if they need like the DevOps or the QA and the legal, and at some point, yeah, you're not in a situation where you can do Scrum. But where do you draw the line, right? So that's the gray area for me. Like,
yeah, I think that kind of going back to the first point that you made, like you just got to get to delivery. And I think one of the problems that we have holistically in organizations is this problem of the sunk cost fallacy. Like, we didn't think of moving this or having this, database field. Now we got to go ahead and we got to go update that and, update the service and all these other things that we have to do because the bank said this. We should have done more analysis. And it's like, no, because even if they would have talked about it, we wouldn't have known until we looked at it that we needed to do this thing. And so we have to be okay with building and then learning that we were wrong and then fixing that thing. If we can do that very fast, I think that's a good thing. But so often we look at that as a negative. And so I think if you build really quickly and you can learn fast, you built the wrong thing, or we need to change it because of this reason or that reason, that's a good thing. Stop talking, start doing. I think that's more of, I don't know, my lesson back to the people, like favor activity and holding on to a tangible thing instead of just talking about stuff for a long period of time, because that is very perishable, those conversations. they lose their value. And even if you document them, like no one goes back and reads that. And then all of a sudden you're like context because you read something different or you miss something. So like that doesn't provide as much value as the actual thing tangible in your hand that you can now see, look, inspect, and then figure out how to adapt to. And that's really what Scrum's about, right? Like it's like, let's build something and then like figure out what to do next.
So the way I always call it is before you start, you have the fog of beforehand. Like it's kind of like you're going up this staircase, you only see the first few steps. Like, but the problem is our usual response when we are faced with such a situation where we cannot see everything or cannot know, we actually start analyzing more. And then you get the fog of speculation, kind of like all these things that you think you know, but you don't. And that are in your plans. And then they're like sunk cost fallacy or like an anchor. And then you need to adjust all these plans. And people don't like that because they spend so much time in meeting rooms talking about it. And then they feel inadequate. So you get this whole cycle of problems, which you could prevent by just not speculating, right? And just like planning a little bit less. But it doesn't come naturally. I believe it's because, in university or at school, it's kind of like, here's the book, you study it, you can get an A+. But when you do complex work, it's kind of like, yeah, your first attempt is going to suck. Right? Sometimes it will be great, but most of the time it's not going to be good. And the next attempt will be better. And yeah, that's fundamentally different.
Yeah, I think we all have a little bit of ego, and sometimes that gets in the way, right? I really like Adam Grant's new book, Think Again, The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know. And really, it's about that same concept. It's like rethinking something that you had very fixed in your mind and being okay with rethinking that is it's a really empowering thing, and it's a good thing for organizations, a good thing for you personally. Like that means you're pretty comfortable in whatever space you're in if you're willing to rethink that again. And so I think we have to do that all the time in product. Like things are changing so rapidly. Like what you knew today is not what's going to be there tomorrow. And so the rules continuously change in this infinite game, and we have to figure out what they are by playing it. And we're going to be wrong. And so just keep playing and keep delivering, and then you'll figure out what to do next, I think is the thing. It's back to your point. Like when the fog comes in, don't slow down, just get more feedback, keep learning.
And I think the key thing is there to do simple things. Like if you do like simple things means less assumptions. And I think the scary part is we actually should do even maybe be a little bit skeptical in the sense that maybe this is too simple, right? Because the problem is if you have an assumption that is wrong, right? Like you will discover, if you put something unnecessary in there, it will stay, right? But if you something which is necessary, like you will probably discover it. And that's the main thing. Like if we build all these complicated things, a lot of that complication will stay. It will not go away. But if you start simple, you can always make it. I think it's easier to add a little bit of complexity. But of course, you need to build in a way that it supports that, right? Because if you make the totally wrong decision, then you're also screwed.
All right, I got two more favors here. I think we talked about. So favor simple things over complex things. I like that one. And favor feedback over analysis. Yeah. I think that sums up what we just kind of talked about.
I think it's a really nice summary.
Jeff likes making my job easy for the show notes. Where he's just like...
Yeah. I was just thinking, like, I've got this whole list I'm writing as we're going here, Jeff, and it's like, boom, this is going to be the show notes. Here's a nice paragraph. So, all right. What other patterns do we see when we're talking about teams? We walk in and we see these things, and what emerges? And we see highly productive teams versus maybe teams that are struggling a little bit.
So one of the things I also see is it's like collaboration over like coordination, in the sense that, like, for example, as a product owner, what you very often see is there's this product owner, he has an epic, he writes 20 user stories, and then he throws them over the fence to the team. And then maybe he's in the refinement, right? But I actually, what I see is that the product owner actually discusses, hey, this is what we're trying to achieve, write the user stories together with the team, maybe even, like much more collaborative, because then, as you know, when you write something down, it's fallible. Like it's going to, so this is also something I really see, like much more collaboration. And of course, in the end, there still is a document, there's still something written, but it's done together. And instead of somebody saying, hey, the user story is wrong or the acceptance criteria, it's kind of like, okay, I can change it. I will change it. So that's also something I really try to support, because if we want empowered teams, they need to be empowered, right? Not like, PO, please change this user story,
Yeah. Go ahead, Jeff. I was thinking of another, I'm going to throw this out there. It's like favor shared ownership over
bottlenecks.
Individual ownership. Yeah. Something like that. Individual ownership or bottlenecks or something like that. Yeah. Like the more people that own that backlog or feel like they can add something to a PBI because they've learned something new, I think that's usually a good thing, because they all feel empowered to change and not have to go through a whole list of maybe approvals or whatever. They have that. They feel that they can, make an impact. Sorry, Jeff, what were you going to say?
You're just making me think about that statement, but I don't know if it's in line with what we were talking about, but the idea of product managers and product owners and how they work together. So if you're in an organization that has product managers, here's the pattern I typically see. We've got product managers, and they're the strategic thinkers. They are typically thinking more long-term, more, I don't know, let's say 1 to 3 years. They own the vision and more of the strategy of trying to get there. And then you've got product owners, which are more tactical and short-term. They're the ones that are typically working more direct with a Scrum team, and they're the ones managing the product backlog. What are your thoughts with that?
Yeah. That mirrors my experience. So basically, to say it very black and white, PM's more strategic, PO's more operational, like delivery. That's what I very often see. And I actually believe it's a huge, I don't know, hope I don't offend anyone. I see it as a huge anti-pattern, because basically the point of empowered teams is like the delivery part. It shouldn't need a lot of the time of the PO. I think that's where the Scrum Master and the PO should work together. To empower these teams so that they understand the direction, the vision, the strategy, that they don't need every second of attention of the PO, so that the PO can spend time talking to customers, understanding the market, and talking to stakeholders. Because the moment the PO gets sucked into the sprint bubble, there's one PO per product, right? And we can argue what's the product, but you're not going to have time to actually think about what is the right product goal, what is the right sprint goal, what is the right, and those are all inputs which are necessary for Scrum to deliver value. So then the PO role doesn't work. Companies solve it by adding the PM, right? But to me, the actual problem is the teams are not empowered, and they're they need so much attention on the operational level. Like a PO, I call it like a product babysitter or something. Sorry. That's something you should fix instead of adding another person and keeping the babysitter. So I hope I don't offend anyone.
But what do you think, Jeff?
I see a lot of organizations that are doing that, Jeff. It's kind of like the product owner is like a team owner, and the product manager is really the product owner. And so owner to me means a very different thing. Like when we say product owner, you own the product. It's like you're a CEO of a company, and you have one. When you're a CEO and you're a CEO of 5 people in a startup, you do very different things than if you have 5,000 people that work inside of your organization. And so I think that you have to delegate. And the problem we have is I think we've coddled a lot of teams, and that they won't want to do the analysis, and they don't want to do the project management. Those are skills that need to live on the people that are building the product. So product development teams need skills of analysis and project management. You don't need a separate role. What happens when you create that structure is you do more coordination with the people doing the work and with the product management area. You add a level of coordination instead of adding collaboration, which is really what we want, and ownership. We're putting in a system that propagates that we are going to take this skill away from you and do it for you because it's too hard, or I don't know, you're overqualified for doing that. I don't know why that we do that, but what the root cause is. But I think that that's just a skill that needs to live on the team, and that's just part of doing work. Like I don't need hands on a keyboard coding 40 hours a week. Like there are some times where if it's coded but it's not delivered, I don't care. Like there's no value to my customer. And so coordination with that marketing team or whomever else to make sure that the customer is getting value is the most important thing that you can do right now. And that's what I want you doing if I'm the owner of that company. If my money's on the line, I want value out the door. I don't care if you're using your skill set. Like I don't know, this is just a whole rant here, but like as an you to code. I am not paying you to do UX work or QA work. I'm paying you to deliver value. And so the most valuable thing is for you to go coordinate something with a marketing team. That's what I want you to do. Like, let's win together and like not worry about the thing we do.
So one thing I do have to say, like to bring back the point, like about the situational, I could imagine, I've never worked in a context like Jeff described, highly regulatory, that then you have so many departments, so many things to take into account. Unless you've really like leveled up as a project manager, it's going to be very difficult for a team to pick up. So that's a situation where I could imagine, right? Maybe there it could make sense because it's very difficult to have the team do this. But I'm not speaking from experience. I have worked at enterprises, but I've never had a situation as Jeff describes, like with all these legal repercussions. Potentially, maybe, right? Maybe there it could make sense, but that's not what most companies do. Like most companies I see just do it because, they have teams that require a lot of handholding.
I think one of the problems, though, Jeff, like in like the situation you described, is as an organization, we're very slow to reform teams, and I think we need to be. We want long-lived teams, but we don't want static teams. And when you have a dependency that's very frequent, you need to put those people together and work on it. Like we've done this before. You have a system down. What do? You go get a cross-functional team and you focus on the one thing, getting the system back up. When you have an urgent thing, like if we don't hit this, like our company's folding, you put a cross-functional team around it and you work on it until it's done. Like we've proven this over and over and over. The power of a cross-functional team, removing all delay and having focused effort is the best way to accomplish something. So if you need legal, if you need the banks, if you need whomever, if you need a cross-functional team across all these stakeholders, put them together and focus on that. Like that's the fastest way to get delivery out. And it's not about cost. It's more about time. I think right now in organizations, we optimize for keeping people busy over it. And then we don't really care about the time so much, or we say we do, but we really don't measure against that, or we don't like use that as the measuring stick. I think time should be the measuring stick. So how do we reduce the time to delivery is what we need to be focused on.
I do think that resource efficiency and flow efficiency are not easy concepts to grasp. Like many people are not that aware of them. And that's also what I think is really important to your point, is to make people understand that, like using everyday examples that they can relate to. For example, the hospital is a good example. Mm-hmm. Doctors are expensive. MRI scanners are expensive. So what do? They maximize the time. These people are busy. What happens as a patient? You're waiting. I mean, my mother had to take a picture. They said, you need to wait a month for the picture. Like, just to have a picture taken. Like, and I think that's a clear example. Another, like the grocery, right? Like, if the cashier is, the person at the counter is 100% busy, then there's going to be a line. And the problem is in software development, that line is your feature, right? That's waiting. It's not getting live. And it's not that easy to understand. It's quite counterintuitive, I believe.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. Maybe what's easy is efficiency. I don't know. We've been really good at that, right? Since the Industrial Revolution, we've really focused on efficiency. And we always are worrying about that. And we're really, really good at it, actually, in society, I think. Like we have a lot to thank for the efficiency of what's going on in the world around us. But when you're too efficient, you don't get predictability and you don't get effective solutions all the time. And it's all about trade-offs. And so if you give a little bit in efficiency, you might be more effective and more predictable. And if that's what you want, that's what I think I want as a business owner. I need to balance those three things. And so we're really, really good at the efficiency thing. And I think sometimes we need to just say, we've been trained to do this for years and years in our lives. We need to just take a step back and say, is this the most productive thing to do in the big picture for the customer, for the company, for whatever the goal is that we have as we're developing something?
I completely agree. And I think that also fits like with the sustainable pace. Like, I mean, I'm not a big fan of the term sprint precisely because it kind of puts you in this mindset like sprint, like, yeah. And I think we're talking about collaboration. We're talking about discovering things, right? And it's kind of like I see someone sitting in a car, like driving to Paris from Amsterdam, right? Doesn't know the way. Then they start driving slowly, right? You see these people in the car with their map or looking at the map, like where do I need to go? Yeah, I think that's the reality. There are times that you sprint, right? Because you know, hey, I need to go this way and I've got it figured out. But there are also times where you're like, you run into a bump and you need help from another team. And that's where I think this whole mindset of a sprint, like that kind of bothers me in a way where I'm like, it's not a sprint. Like you need to have room to sprint because the unexpected happens. So you shouldn't be sprinting because sometimes you do need to speed up, like to help others or to fix a certain bump. And that's why you shouldn't be doing it by default, because then you're going at max speed. There's no room to help others. There's no room like to actually accelerate a little bit or put a bit more effort in case it's necessary.
Yeah, it's like container or time box might be better words. I don't know to describe what we're literally talking about there. I don't know. That's an interesting topic. I don't know. I'm going to pivot here for just on the fly. Yeah. What are other things inside of the Scrum guide maybe that you don't like words you don't like? So we talked about sprint. One that I don't like is developer. I would love to change it to product developer. Yeah. And I've said this over again, because it's like people think developer and coding, hands on a keyboard. I want people to develop a product. And many of the words inside of the Scrum guide, if you flip them around, like we plan the sprint, we review the sprint, we retrospect on the sprint. Like if you reverse them, it tells you exactly what they do. We develop the product. It doesn't mean coding. We develop the product. So product developer is what I would, love to change it to.
I really like it. So the one thing which interests me, and maybe you can tell, so I had this long discussion on LinkedIn because when I read the new Scrum guide, it really is focused on fixing complex adaptive problems. So the way I interpreted it was, it's actually more generic now. It's not about products, like you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But then it still contains words like product increments and developer, like, so I struggle with that. Like, so do you know what was the intention of that change? Like, is it because my impression is they're trying to be a bit more generic, but then why do we still have a word like product increment in there? Like, what is a product? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. I don't know. Like, I think they do define parts of it. They talk about the things that are included inside of a product. And I like that paragraph where they talk about, all the analysis, all the marketing, the like discovery, the delivery, like all of that is included in the work of the team to create an increment. So like they do kind of give you that definition, which they never had before. I really like that paragraph inside of the Scrum guide. I do think that more and more of the world is finding that they have complex problems that they need to deal with. And Scrum's getting used in a lot of different contexts. I mean, from making drugs to fighter jets to cars to new tractors to marketing to whatever. Like it's in so many different contexts right now, and I think there's a lot of words that we've used in the product development space that maybe don't quite make sense there, and they're trying to build it as a framework, and then there's a lot of different practices you can get in there. And I think that's what, I don't know, hopefully what we covered today in our podcast is like, here's some practices to try. You can be doing the framework, but if you see some of these practices and some of these practices, here's maybe some things to favor over other things. And I'm just kind of summing up based on what Jeff said before, like it's a journey. And it took me a while, like personally, to learn this as I worked with teams, is that I wanted them to be at a certain spot, but every team needs to go through their own journey, try many different patterns and practices, and they'll find their path as they do them. But it's really about experimentation. And like what you can do as being a part of that team is to help facilitate that, so people keep moving in the journey and don't just stand still and be content with, having something very static.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So to get back to your original question, right? Product owner, I'm not a big fan of the label because people think product owner is like less important than the product manager. Like, and I get the intent, right? I do get the intent. Like it's one person that owns the product. But what I see in practice is that people think product manager is like more prestigious. You know what I mean? It has and that's kind of like where I'm like, where's the inspect and adapt there, right? Like, and on one hand, you could say, hey, this is Scrum. These are the labels. Abide by them because this is how it's defined. But on the other hand, in practice, you see that people don't really get it. And maybe that's because of safe, right? Or because of other things going on. But then that's kind of like where I'm like, why does that happen? Is there something we can do? Maybe there isn't, right? But that's why I'm.
I don't know. One of the things that is confusing is when different people use the same word for different things. They mean different things. And I think like the safe example is one, right? Or when someone says product owner now, we actually have to have a conversation in an organization. Like, what do you mean by product owner? What does a product owner do in your organization? Because there's like so many different types of product owners out there, or product managers. So I don't know. I think that's confusing. So maybe that, I don't know that we want to change it in the Scrum guide because people have used that as a base and then they've changed it. But it is confusing when other people use the same word to mean.
We still hear about
different.
backlog grooming, right?
Yeah.
Like how long ago has that been changed? That's the biggest worry. But maybe, maybe it doesn't matter what we call it anymore. We'll just hear it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that topic on the product, you were talking about product owner, but it's the same thing for product manager. And I'm willing to bet you could, like many of these roles, you could go into 5 different organizations, and like product manager at organization 1 is going to be a whole lot different than product manager at organization 3. So I feel like that's just par for the course and really nothing to do with Scrum. It is a little bit overloaded now because you've got basically 2 terms that are essentially the same thing. One just works with a Scrum team. If you don't have a Scrum team, well, then you probably just have product managers. But then it got a little bit convoluted when Scrum was introduced. One thing I was thinking about, and this might be too big of a topic, but like thinking about things, if we wanted to have experience owners versus product owners. And so what I mean by that is we were talking earlier about metrics. And whenever I think about them, I always think about like our metrics. So acquisitions, activation, revenue, retention, referrals, right? You can think about that as a journey that a customer goes through for your product, right? Somehow they were acquired, right? Typically through marketing, clickbait, whatever, right? Like somehow they got acquired and they get on. They actually download, install, set up the app. So now that they're activated, or activated is in like the I forget the phrase, but the thing that hooks them, right? So they're now an active user, they're now activated. However you want to think about that. Revenue, yep, obviously they start getting billed. Retention, okay. How satisfied are they? And then referral, how often are they actually referring the app or your product? But if you thought about that as just a journey, right? So you've got a cell phone, right? At some point you went and you purchased your cell phone. You're using your cell phone on a daily basis. You're cruising the web, you're talking to the family, you're sending text messages. And at some point you're going to have an issue with that cell phone. And you're going to call up tech support, right? Like all of that is still part of your experience with the product that is your cell phone service or your phone, or however you want to think about it and articulate it, right? Like I can all but guarantee when you called in because you had an issue with your cell phone, it was a shit experience, right? Like, but that is part of your customer journey. That is part of your customer experience. And as I think about, I would love to have somebody who owns that end-to-end experience to making sure that it's a consistent experience so that it's optimized across the board. But then we partner that with product owners or product managers who are typically not going to have that end-to-end ownership inside of there, that end-to-end visibility. They're going to be thinking about the phone, right? Or maybe the plans that go along with that phone, right? Or some subset inside of there. So I guess I'm pontificating a little bit here, but I'm curious, like, how does that change when we think about a product owner, product manager versus an experience owner that really has that end-to-end journey that a customer goes on and really owns that end-to-end? Do you see those as the same thing, or is that something completely separate?
So I think you're touching on a very important point. And I think also Jurgen Appelo is writing more about this, like the experience. And I've never really seen a product owner in that sense. Like, but I mean, I'm a head of product, right? So I'm a product owner, but there's still the CEO. If he can overrule me. So I'm not really product owner. Of course, I have a lot of, but experience owner, I've never seen, right? Like somebody who owns every part of the experience. I do think it really matters because at the end of the day, if someone picks up your phone and tech support has a bad experience, they're never going to buy your product again. So I think it's super important to own this whole experience. But I don't know. Maybe that's a good word, experience owner.
Yeah.
But how would it work? I don't know. Like, I've never done it.
The way I've been thinking about it is internally aligning. If I had a magic wand, aligning a product manager to a persona, and then so in our context, I'll simplify it, right? So for payments and transactions, thinking peer to peer. Maarten, you and Jeff go out to lunch. You want to split the bill, right? So you request a payment from Jeff to cover his portion, etc. So inside of there's essentially four personas, right? You've got Maarten as a customer who is requesting funds. You've got Jeff as a customer who is sending funds, or users, whatever. I don't want to overcomplicate it. And then you've got each of your financial institutions, right? So in my head, I'm thinking if you had a product manager or experience owner that was aligned to each one of those four personas in there, and they had holistic view of all the journeys that they go on to, I think about them like horizontally slicing right through that the typical journey map. That's where I would feel like you could potentially have some visibility there. But then I would suspect you've got product managers that are in the verticals that support the journey more holistically. And so then again, it's like, what do you define as your product? Do you define the journey or the experience as the product, or the verticals as the product in each of the areas that they step through? I think we're getting a little deeper. I think that
product definition is all about trade-offs. And as you add more people, there's going to be more like, well, there's connections to this other thing, and we need a holistic view of that so that these things work together. And that it's been done before too, right? Jürgen has that in his model. So does, Less Huge has that, where they have the product owner and then the area product owners, right, inside of those. And then how you define those areas of your product ownership, right? Like there is a number of people that you can coordinate where you hit a maximum. And it's like when you get over 50 in an area, like it's hard to coordinate and work together. So we should probably have these areas of focus. And so, coding, like the code bases make a big difference. Like where do we have these dependencies from that? And where do we have dependencies from the customers? And where do we have these intersections? And there's so many things to consider. And I think there's trade-offs in many different ways. I think what you illustrated, Jeff, is a valid area. Like, could it be an experience? Sure. Could it also be based off of things you do? Maybe it's the same people. Like Maarten and I each do different things. Like you talked about in a previous episode, we both have to register for your product. So that's one owner that you could have, or product manager inside of an area. We both have to use the product on transactions, and we both want to look at history and be able to like reference things to, make sure something's right. Like there's going to be a time where it's like, hey, did that payment go through? Did I actually, get that money back into my bank, or did I miss something there? Like there's going to be those kind of flows too. So you can slice it many different ways. I think there's just trade-offs of like where these handoffs are from the people doing the work, the code, and the customers, and you just have to find the right balance, between all of those things. Especially when you add more people, it just gets more complex. Like you just, you're gonna have to weigh the options and pick the best thing, and maybe be willing to change it if things change in the future. All right, so Maarten, thanks for joining us. We really, really appreciate your time, the conversation. It's always fun to, discover new things and have things emerge in a conversation like this. So, at this time, is there anything you want to plug to our listeners or promote to them, or maybe how they can connect to you?
If you liked this conversation, you can follow me on LinkedIn or follow me on Medium. I'm writing a book on sprint goals, the My Cone series. So that's hopefully coming out probably next year. I will finish it this year, but it takes some time. So yeah, that's about it.
All right, thanks.
Thank you for listening to the Agile Wire. We are consistently inspecting and adapting ourselves. We would appreciate feedback at feedback@theagilewire.com or on iTunes, Spotify, or Google Play Store. See you next time.